Hello, everybody. I'm Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriot's History of the United States with Michael Allen, and I will be your host here through this reading in the section of Patriot's History of the United States. As always, we are going from using the 15th anniversary edition. The 20th anniversary edition is done. It is ready to go. We are now offering it as part of a purchase. If you get the VIP subscription. You can go online. There's so much stuff I can't tell you about how much great stuff is on there, including about 50 hours of video. But if you get a subscription to the VIP at Wild World of History, or if you get an insider subscription to the Wild World of Politics, where we talk things political, you will get a free advanced copy of the 20th anniversary edition, which consists of a PDF of a whole new chapter, about a 60-page chapter from 2018 to the 2023. And it includes many, many inserted editions of new research and new material that we found here going back through the last several years of research. And so make sure you check that out. If you want a copy right away of the 20th anniversary of Patriot's History of the United States, subscribe to the Wild World of History VIP or the Wild World of Politics Insider. All right, so here's what we're going to do. Now, normally we would start on a page and at a header, and we will be at page 279, and the header is the political pendulum. And this is something that I have not seen any other historian or historians do, which is track the period from about 1830 to the Civil War as a pendulum swinging back and forth between who seemed to be having the advantage at the time. There were times it looked like the South had the advantage and that slavery was going to be successfully defended and ensconced and, in fact, expanded. And then there were other times that it looked like, no, slavery is going to come under attack here. It's going to be contained. It's going to be rolled back. And this is a good lesson for modern politics as well, because the pendulum doesn't stay on one side forever, no matter which side you're on. I'll never forget Vice President Dick Cheney's speech at the Republican convention in 2000. And whatever you think of Cheney, it was a pretty good speech in talking about the Clintons. And he said, the wheel has turned and it's time for them to go. Well, the wheel's about to turn again, I think, and it's time for some other Democrats to go. But it doesn't always stay that way. That's just American politics. So what we do in this chapter and in this section, the House Divided in the section called Political Pendulum, is track the swings back and forth for over 30 years over who thought they were gaining the advantage over the slavery issue, with, of course, abolitionists thinking we've about got it there. We're almost going to get to emancipation. And the pro-slave forces in the South thinking we're about there. We just about have it made permanent in the Constitution. So with that in mind, I'm going to read to you a section from the new material, from the new 20th anniversary edition. And this will go, you would insert this right before the political pendulum on page 279. In fact, let me stop something here. Keep seeing things that I need to address here. Hold on. Okay, there we go. I found something, actually a error in the page number. So this will go on page 279 before the header called the political pendulum. Abolitionism, which had gradually spread through the North and still lacked a cohesive constitutional argument prior to 1800. English law, through the Somerset decision, did not recognize property in man. And indeed, the Constitution had seemed to support slavery through its deference to states' rights, but in fact, it did not. It referred to, quote, unfree persons or, quote, persons held in service, but never to slaves as chattel property. Now, this is from a book by James Oakes, O-A-K-E-S, called Freedom National, published in 2013. Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, 1861 through 1865. And we had not seen this when we did our last update. Very powerful book. If it wasn't so darn long, it'd probably be in my list of top 5 books. Whereas David Potter's The Impending Crisis says almost as much in maybe 200 fewer pages. But anyway, it's still a great book. So back to the text. Anti-slavery forces, according to historian James Oakes, quote, formulated 2 distinct scenarios for the national assault on slavery, including federal pressure on states to abolish slavery themselves and military emancipation if the slave states rebelled. By 1830, no one, save Martin Van Buren and Thomas Jefferson, really thought a war would come. Moreover, wherever the Constitution, not state law, was sovereign, on the high seas, in D.C., in the territories, the abolitionists would act. So they would start acting where they had the authority to act. This idea became the spine of the strategy to build a, quote, cordon of freedom around the slave states. As for the military abolition, that occurred during the Second Seminole War, where the military emancipated hundreds of slaves, as was argued in the Amistad case. It began with the New York slaves who were still in bondage being shifted from the category of property to servile status that gave them property rights, secure marriage, and terms for the end of their slavery. A very important Massachusetts case followed called the Med case, involving a 6-year-old girl who was set free because under Massachusetts law, she was not property, and thus established, quote, the single most important premise on which all anti-slavery politics would soon be built. There was no such thing as a constitutional right to property in slaves, unquote. That's the basis on which the abolitionists now are going to proceed for the next 30 years. Next, abolitionists such as Theodore Weld and later Frederick Douglass argued that slavery itself was an assault on property rights, in that an individual's claim of ownership to his own person were violated, making abolition the restoration of property rights. To get that, you have property rights in your own person, and therefore, if someone else controls that person, you have lost your own property rights to yourself. It was only a matter of time before the concept came up in national cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, as in the Groves v. Slaughter case of 1841, in which Justice John McLean concluded the Constitution recognized slaves only as persons, not as property. Lincoln had agreed, saying where personhood and property came into conflict, he would side with the person. Now, this may seem splitting hairs. It's a fundamentally powerful and ultimately deciding argument. That is, what is a slave? Is a slave a person or a piece of property like a cow or a chair? Well, the obvious answer is a person. Well, once you establish personhood, then you cannot support slavery much longer because you are depriving a person of all those rights pronounced in the Declaration of Independence to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. It was only a matter of time before the concept came up in national cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, as in the Groves v. Slaughter case of 1841, where Justice John McLean concluded the Constitution recognized slaves only as a person, not as property. Okay. During this time, Northerners began to think of the reason abolition was taking so long was because of a, quote, slave power conspiracy. They saw this as power, quote, seated in the president's chair, ruling in the council chamber, judging on the bench of the Supreme Court, moving to and fro armed among senators and representatives. For more on the slave power conspiracy, as the first of several swamps presidents have fought, see my book, Larry Schweikart, Dragon Slayers, 6 Presidents and Their War with the Swamp, came out in 2022. Okay. The genius of the strategy adopted by the new Republican Party began to dawn on some Southerners who warned that it would, quote, undermine the pillars of the institution of slavery, then wait quietly for the whole edifice to crumble. Well, yeah. So increasingly, the slave South adopted a more aggressive role. To sit still was to face emancipation. Get it? They saw where this was heading. It prompted them to be more aggressive in trying to expand slavery, because if they couldn't expand it, they would lose it. The so-called Crittenden Compromise, for example, called for repudiation of every Republican policy aimed at undermining slavery. The final evidence that even the South knew war might bring abolition came in a new study of slave prices following Lincoln's election. Prices declined by almost 1/3 from their pre-secession peak, reflecting Southern pessimism about the likely outcome of the war. Moreover, it reflected the view that once abolition came, it would be without compensation. And this is from a new working paper by Charles Calomiris and Jonathan Pritchett called Betting on Secession, November 2013. By the way, just a little inside baseball. Years and years ago, maybe around 2010, I was working with Charlie and John on this paper. We were originally all going to do it together, and one thing led to another, and I had to pull out to do some other projects, or I might have been a part of that paper as well. So that's the new material that I wanted to read to you. All right, let's get back to this edition, the 15th anniversary edition, and start with the header, The Political Pendulum. From 1848 to 1860, the South rode a roller coaster of euphoria followed by depression. Several times, solid guarantees for the continued protection of slavery appeared to be within grasp of Southerners, only to be suddenly snatched away by new and even more foreboding signs of Northern abolitionist sentiment. This pendulum began with the election of Zachary Taylor, continued with the California statehood question, accelerated its swing with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and finally spun out of control with the Dred Scott decision and its repercussions. The first swing of the pendulum came with the election of 1848. Van Buren's assumption that only a, quote, northern man of Southern principles could hold the nation together as president continued to direct the Democrat Party. So remember, Van Buren had this idea when he starts the Democrat Party that you're going to govern or rule via spoils and rewards, money. You're going to pay people off to shut up about slavery. But also it required, as the second leg, that you have a president who was either a northern man of Southern principles, a northerner who would not touch slavery, or a westerner, because westerners such as Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk were viewed as pure or somehow apart from sectional differences, okay? And you got that all the way from 1836 to 1860. The first swing of the pendulum came with the election of 1848. Van Buren's assumptions that only a northern man of Southern principles could hold the nation together as president continued to direct the Democratic Party, which nominated Lewis Cass of Michigan. Cass originated a concept later made famous by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas called popular sovereignty. As Cass and Douglas understood it, only the people of a territory during the process by which they developed their state constitution could prohibit slavery. Congress, whether in its function as administrator of the territories or its national legislative function, had no rule or no role in legislating slavery. It was a convenient out in that Cass and Douglas could claim they were personally opposed to slavery, ever without having to undertake any action against it. It's where you see some, no longer nearly as many as you used to, but you still see some politicians. Well, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I got to vote in favor of abortion rights, right? The old personally opposed thing. I'm personally opposed to slavery. but I'm going to vote for it. Let's see. In reality, popular sovereignty ensured exactly what transpired in Kansas, that both pro and anti-slavery forces would seek to rig the state constitutional convention through infusions of often temporary immigrants. Once the deed was done and a pro-slavery constitution was in place, the recent arrivals could leave if they chose, but slavery would remain. Whigs, too, realized the pro-slavery vote was strong and the free soil vote not strong enough to run strictly on slavery or related economic issues. They needed a candidate who would not antagonize the South, and many prominent Whigs fell in behind Zachary, old rough and ready Taylor, the Mexican War general. Taylor, however, was a Louisiana slaveholder who offered free soil Whigs who offended free soil Whigs who distrusted him. Taylor's ownership of slaves cost him within the party, except for his Negroes and cotton bales, one congressman wrote, he would have won the nomination without opposition. But when Clay delivered an important address in Lexington, Kentucky, disavowing any acquisition of new slave territories in the Mexican War, he lost Southern support. His April 1844 Raleigh letter, in which he opposed annexation of Texas, did him irreparable damage. Clay just can't seem to come down on the right side of these things when he needs to. He just always seems to be, as they used to say, a day late and a dollar short. Privately, Taylor was less Whiggish than he let on. He told intimates that the idea of a national bank, quote, is dead and will not be revived in my time, and promised to raise tariffs only for revenue. But Taylor benefited from a reviving economy, which made the election almost entirely about personality, where he had the reputation and the edge. A third party, the new Free Soil Party, siphoned off both Democrats and Whigs who opposed slavery. Free Soilers nominated Martin Van Buren, demonstrating the futility of Van Buren's earlier efforts to exclude slavery from the national political debate. You just can't do it. He should have known you can't do it. I don't care how many spoils you offer someone, sooner or later, they're going to start talking about their views on slavery. Van Buren's forces drew in abolitionists, Liberty Party refugees, and conscience Whigs who opposed slavery under the slogan free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Free Soilers made a strong showing at the polls, raking in more than 10% of the vote, but did not change the outcome. Taylor won by an electoral vote margin 163 to 137 and a 5% margin of the popular vote. Virtually all the free soil ballots would have gone to the Whigs, who, despite Taylor's slave ownership, were viewed as the anti-slavery party. It's probable that Ohio would have gone to Taylor if not for the Free Soilers. The new president was nevertheless something of an odd duck. He never voted in an American election. He relished his no-party affiliation. Most Americans learned what they knew of him through newspaper accounts of his remarkable military victories. Indeed, in a sense, Taylor was the first outsider to ever run for the presidency. Jackson, although different from the elites who had dominated the White House, nevertheless willingly employed party machinery for his victory. Taylor, however, stressed his anti-party, almost renegade image, much the way that populist candidates of the 1880s and independents like John Anderson and H. Ross Perot did in the 1980s and 1990s. The outsider appeal proved powerful because it gave people a sense that they could, quote, vote for the man, largely on reputation or personality, without hashing out all the tough decisions demanded by a party platform. How many times have you heard that? Oh, I just vote for the man or the woman. I just vote for, I don't look at party structure. Well, you better, because whoever that man or woman is, they are at some point going to be tied to a party platform that states all their positions and objectives. And if they are fortunate enough to have a Senate or a House along with them, that Senate and House are almost certainly going to be tied to that same party, those same party principles. So it's a little naive and childish to say, I just vote for the man. You better look at a comprehensive program of what that man stands for and what the edifice behind him believes in, because sooner or later, that man or that woman is going to end up doing exactly what the rest of that structure demands they do. There are renegades like Jackson and Trump, but for the most part, you're going to end up doing what the structure tells you to do. Let's see. The outsider appeal proved powerful because it gave people a sense that they could vote for the man largely on personality without hashing out all the tough decisions demanded by a party platform. A Taylor supporter in Massachusetts claimed that enthusiasm for Taylor, quote, springs from spontaneous combustion and will sweep all before it, unquote. To assuage the concerns of Northern Whigs, Taylor accepted Millard Fillmore of Buffalo as his vice president. In policy, Taylor surprised both parties. Although he sympathized with the South's need to protect slavery, he wanted to keep it out of California and New Mexico. He announced that in due course, California, Utah, and New Mexico would apply for statehood directly without going through the territorial stage. Under these circumstances, the states themselves, not Congress, would determine whether they allowed slaves. Taylor hoped to finesse the Southerners, reasoning that since they had already stated they expected these territories to be free soil, there would be no need for the Wilmot Proviso. Remember that it said there would be no slavery in the Western territories gained in the Mexican War. Nevertheless, he included a strong warning against the kind of disunion talk that had circulated in the South. When an October 1849 convention laid plans for a meeting of delegates from all the slaveholding states in Nashville, sort of a pre-Confederacy, the following year, attendees issued statements favoring disunion by leaders such as Congressman Robert Toombs of Georgia. Increasingly, such sentiments were invoked, and astute politicians of both sections took notice. California presented an opportunity for Henry Clay to regain the initiative he had lost in the nominating process. He started machinery in motion to bring California into the Union, a plan that constituted nothing less than a final masterful stroke at compromise by the aging Kentuckian. Clay introduced legislation to combine the 8 major points of contention over slavery in the new territories into 4 legislative headings. Then, his oratorical skills undiminished, Clay took the national stage one last time. His final resolution called for California's admission as a free state. Second, the status of Utah and New Mexico territories was to be determined by popular sovereignty, i.e., the people of those territories would decide. Third, he proposed to fix the western boundary of Texas where it then stood, halting slavery for a time being by leaving the New Mexico border intact. This provision also committed the federal government to assuming the debts of Texas, which was guaranteed to garner some support in the Lone Star State. Fourth, he sought to eliminate the slave trade in the District of Columbia. And finally, he offered a fugitive slave law that promised to deliver escaped slaves from one state to another. Debate over Clay's compromise bill brought John Calhoun from his sickbed, although Senator James Mason of Virginia read all of Calhoun's speech, followed by stirring oratory from Daniel Webster. Both agreed that disunion was unthinkable. To the surprise of many, neither attacked the resolutions. Quite the contrary, Webster promised not to include Wilmot as a, quote, taunt or a reproach, thereby extending the olive branch to the South. The debates culminated with Taylor supporter William H. Seward's famous higher law speech, that there is, quote, a higher law than the Constitution, meaning that the Constitution permitted slavery. Seward felt morally justified in ignoring it in favor of higher moral principle. Meanwhile, Clay thought that tactically he had guaranteed the passage of the bill by tying the disparate parts together in a single package. While Clay and his allies worked to defuse the sectional crisis, Taylor became ill and died on the 9th of July. Millard Fillmore assumed the presidency amidst a rapidly unraveling controversy over Texas-New Mexico border. Fillmore was the first president other than the Adamses not to have owned a slave at any time in his life, and as such, he was automatically suspect with the South. The end of July, Clay's compromise measures were carved away from the omnibus bill and were defeated individually. Only Utah's territorial status passed. California statehood, the Texas boundary, the fugitive slave law all went down to stunning defeat. The strain proved so great on the 73-year-old Clay that he left for Kentucky to recuperate. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and Seward, arch enemies of the compromise from the opposite ends of the spectrum, celebrated openly. Their victory dance, however, didn't last long. Another rising force in American politics had stood patiently outside those contentious debates. Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, born in Vermont. Douglas studied law before moving to Ohio in 1833. There he contracted typhoid fever, recovered, and moved on to Illinois. A natural politician, Douglas had supported continuing the 36-degree, 30-minute line and backed Polk on the Mexican War. In 1848, his new wife inherited more than 100 slaves, which tarnished his image in Illinois. He nevertheless was elected senator by the Illinois legislature in 1846, after which he chaired the important Committee on Territories. From that position, Douglas would advance popular sovereignty in the territories. When it came to the Compromise of 1850, Douglas saw the key to passage as exactly the opposite of Clay's strategy, namely, bringing up the various resolutions again independently and attempting to forge coalitions on each separately. Moreover, Fillmore announced his full support of the compromise, and after accepting the resignation of the Taylor cabinet, named Webster as his Secretary of State. Meanwhile, Douglas maneuvered the Texas boundary measure through Congress. One explosive issue was settled, and Douglas quickly followed with individual bills that admitted California, established New Mexico as a territory, and provided a fugitive slave law. Utah's territorial bill also passed. The final vote to obtain federal enforcement, final vote on the fugitive slave law, saw many Northerners abstaining, allowing the South to obtain federal enforcement. Douglas's strategy was brilliant and doomed. Lawmakers drank all night after its passage and woke up with terrible hangovers and a sense of dread. There was even a question as to whether it was truly a compromise. Few Southerners voted for any Northern provision, and few Northerners ever voted for any of the pro-Southern resolutions. All of the compromise came from a group of Ohio Valley representatives who voted for both sides of the measures on 5 ballots. The very states that would become the bloody battlegrounds of the war broke out, Maryland, Tennessee, Missouri, Kentucky, provided the entire compromise element. For the North and South, however, the compromise was an agreement to maneuver for still stronger positions. In other words, we'll wait until a better time. With the North betting on congressional representation as its advantage, and the South wagering on federal guarantees of runaway slaves. Fillmore called the compromise, quote, final and irrevocable, not noticing that secessionists had nearly won control of 4 lower Southern state governments. By supporting the compromise, Fillmore also ensured that the anti-slavery wing of the Whig Party would block his nomination in 1852 in favor of Winfield Scott, good old Fuss and Feathers. Scott's enemies referred to him as old Fuss and Feathers, while his supporters called him by the more affectionate Old Chippewa or Old Chapultepec after his military victories. A Virginian, Scott hoped to reprise the, quote, Whig Southerner success of Taylor 4 years earlier. The Democrats, meanwhile, closed ranks around their candidate, Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. Neither side took seriously the virulent secessionist talk bubbling forth from the lower South. So that's a great place to stop right there. We'll pick up again with our pendulum theory coming out next time. Meanwhile, grab yourself a copy of Patriot's History of Globalism. If you want an autographed copy, email me at larry@wildworldofhistory.com. I will tell you how to go about getting an autographed copy, and I'll see you guys back here on Monday.